Get out of the car. The voice sliced through the air like a blade. The man behind the wheel froze, his hands gripping the steering wheel as flashing red and blue lights reflected in the mirror. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't breaking any laws. He had done absolutely nothing wrong. Yet here he was, staring at a police officer with his hand already resting on his holster. I said, get out of the car. The officer's voice was sharper this time, cutting through any hesitation. Officer, there must be some misunderstanding, he began, keeping his tone calm and measured, the way he had practiced so many times. Years of training told him to stay composed, but his heart pounded against his ribs. The officer yanked the door open before he could finish. I didn't ask for your excuses. Step out now. The man complied, slowly lifting his hands as he stepped out. The cold air hit him, but it wasn't nearly as cold as the officer's stare. A crowd had already started to gather in the parking lot of the upscale restaurant. They whispered, pointed, and raised their phones. Someone was recording. He glanced around, locking eyes with a woman who looked horrified but didn't dare speak up. The officer stepped closer, towering over him. What are you doing in this car? A stolen Mercedes in this neighborhood? Doesn't add up, does it? It's not stolen, he said, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. It's mine. Oh, it's yours? The officer laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. You're telling me this car, worth more than my salary, belongs to you? It does, he said, reaching into his pocket. I have my ID and registration. The officer shoved him back, hard enough to make him stumble. Keep your hands where I can see them. The humiliation burned. People were still watching. Still recording. But no one moved to help. I'm following your orders, officer, he said, holding his hands up again. The officer circled him like a predator, eyes scanning him from head to toe. I've seen your kind before. Flashy suits, expensive cars. Think you can buy your way out of anything. Not this time. He wanted to speak, to shout, to scream, but he knew better. He had spent his whole life learning how to navigate moments like this, how to stay alive. But the officer wasn't done. With one swift motion, he kicked the back of his knee, forcing him down onto the pavement. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This is insane, he shouted, finally breaking composure. I have rights. You have the right to shut up. The officer barked before pinning him to the ground. Gravel dug into his palms. The officer's knee pressed into his back. What crime did I commit? He managed to choke out. Driving while black, someone muttered in the crowd, low but loud enough to sting. He wanted to disappear, to sink into the earth and never resurface. But something inside him refused to break. Even with his face pressed to the pavement, even as the officer tightened the cuffs around his wrists, he held on to that fire inside him, the fire that had carried him through law school, that had built his reputation, that had earned him respect in every courtroom he'd ever stepped into. The officer hauled him to his feet, turning him toward the growing crowd. This is what happens when you don't know your place, the officer spat, loud enough for everyone to hear. But even as he stood there, humiliated and furious, he could see the cracks forming. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were questioning. Phones stayed raised. Eyes shifted uneasily. And somewhere deep in his chest, that fire burned brighter. Because what the officer didn't know, what no one there could have guessed, was that the man he had just thrown to the ground wasn't just any man. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't helpless. He wasn't powerless. He was one of the most influential attorneys in the state. He knew the law better than anyone. And as he stood there, face flushed and hands bound, he was already planning his next move. The officer had no idea who he had just crossed. But he was about to find out. What happened in the next few minutes would send shockwaves through the city, through the department, and leave everyone asking the same question, how could one man's arrogance destroy everything he thought he controlled? And more importantly, how far would justice go to make things right? Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to address something important. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. This channel is a safe space for powerful storytelling that highlights justice, equality, and resilience. To our Black viewers and anyone who has faced injustice, we see you, we hear you, and we support you. Your voice matters, and your stories deserve to be told. Now, get ready for an intense and emotional story that will leave you thinking long after it ends. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a twist. Enjoy the story. The evening air was crisp, and the soft glow of the city lights reflected off the sleek black Mercedes parked outside the restaurant. Inside the car, Darius Cole adjusted his tie, taking a deep breath as he prepared for the evening ahead. He glanced at the time. He was early, as always, a habit ingrained from years of discipline and long nights spent building a career that many had doubted he could ever achieve. From the outside, Darius was the picture of success. His tailored suit hugged his broad shoulders, and the polished leather briefcase in the passenger seat was a subtle reminder of the power he carried wherever he went. But tonight wasn't about courtrooms or contracts. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. After years of tireless work, Darius had finally landed a partnership at one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. It was a title that came with more than just a corner office and a pay raise. It was validation, proof that all the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, and the battles he fought, both in and out of the courtroom, had been worth it. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing down his short, neatly trimmed hair. Confidence radiated from him, but beneath the surface, there was always a layer of tension, a habit that had followed him since childhood. Growing up in South Memphis, Darius had learned early that the world didn't always see him the way he saw himself. He'd been underestimated, dismissed, and judged more times than he could count. But instead of letting it break him, he let it fuel him. His mother, Lorraine, had always told him, "They'll expect you to fail, baby. Prove them wrong." And he had. Over and over again. Darius exhaled slowly, shaking off the weight of old memories as he grabbed his briefcase and stepped out of the car. The restaurant's valet approached with a polite nod, but Darius waved him off. He preferred to park his own car, another habit he couldn't quite let go of, no matter how much success he achieved. He locked the door and turned toward the entrance, his thoughts already shifting to the night ahead. But then he heard it. "Hey!" The voice was sharp, commanding, and it cut through the hum of traffic like a blade. Darius turned, his eyes narrowing as a uniformed officer stepped out of a patrol car parked nearby. The officer's hand rested casually on his belt, just inches from his gun. "Is there a problem, officer?" Darius kept his voice steady, though his pulse had quickened. He had faced plenty of obstacles in his life, but he had also learned how quickly situations like this could escalate. The officer, whose name tag read, R. Keller, tilted his head, sizing Darius up with a look that made his skin crawl. "What are you doing here?" Darius raised an eyebrow. "I'm attending an event inside." Keller's eyes flicked to the Mercedes parked behind Darius. "You drive that?" "Yes," Darius replied, his jaw tightening. Keller took a step closer, his boots heavy against the pavement. "Mind telling me how you can afford a car like that?" Darius inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his ID and registration. "Everything you need is right here." But Keller didn't even glance at the documents. Instead, he crossed his arms and smirked. "Guys like you always think you're smarter than everyone else. But I know a liar when I see one." Darius felt his stomach knot. He had been in situations like this before, too many times. He had played out the conversations, the steps, the warnings in his head, but it never prepared him for the sting of it happening again. Not now. Not here. Officer, I don't want any trouble, Darius said carefully, tucking the papers back into his jacket. Trouble? Keller's eyes darkened. You think I'm giving you trouble? I'm just doing my job. Or is following the law too much for you? Darius's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Keller's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. Hey! Darius snapped, yanking his arm free. That's enough. But Keller wasn't backing down. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a low, threatening tone. You think you can talk to me like that? Darius knew the situation was spiraling. The crowd outside the restaurant was starting to notice. Phones were coming out. Whispers were spreading. But Keller didn't seem to care. Get on the ground. Keller barked, his voice echoing off the walls. Darius froze. What? You heard me. On the ground. Keller's hand went to his holster, and Darius felt his stomach drop. This is insane, Darius said, his voice firm but trembling just enough to betray the storm raging inside him. Keller took a step forward, and before Darius could move, he felt the hard shove that sent him stumbling. His knee hit the pavement, and the sting shot up his leg. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Stay down. Keller snapped, pressing his knee into Darius's back. Darius's breathing came in sharp, shallow bursts. The humiliation burned, but the anger burned hotter. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but he knew better. He had seen how these situations ended. And yet, even with his face pressed to the pavement, even as Keller tightened the cuffs around his wrists, Darius wasn't broken. He couldn't be. Not now. Not when he had come so far. The crowd was still watching, still recording. But no one moved to help. No one dared to step forward. Keller leaned down, his breath hot against Darius's ear. This is what happens when you forget your place. But Keller didn't know who he was dealing with. Darius wasn't just some guy in a suit. He wasn't powerless. He wasn't helpless. And as the officer hauled him to his feet, Darius lifted his head and met the eyes of the crowd. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Darius sat in the cold, hard chair of the precinct's holding room, his wrists aching from the tightness of the cuffs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the beige walls. His suit was rumpled now, his tie loosened and hanging awkwardly around his neck. Across the table, Officer Keller leaned back in his chair, arms crossed and a smug grin plastered across his face. The room reeked of sweat and old coffee, but it wasn't the stench that made Darius's stomach churn, it was the smirk. That look of satisfaction, of unchecked power, was enough to make his blood boil. So, Keller said, tapping his pen against the table, you're telling me you're some big-shot lawyer? That's cute. Darius didn't flinch. He sat up straighter, meeting Keller's gaze without hesitation. I am a lawyer, he said firmly, his voice steady. And what you did tonight is illegal. Keller laughed, leaning forward. Illegal? Is that so? You think anyone's going to care about your little complaint? I've been doing this job for 10 years, and let me tell you something, you're not the first, and you sure as hell won't be the last. Darius clenched his fists under the table, but he didn't let his anger show. Keller wanted him to snap, to lose control. But Darius knew better. He had spent years mastering the art of patience, of keeping his composure even when every fiber of his being screamed for him to fight back. You should call your lawyer, Keller said, leaning back in his chair again. Oh, wait. That's you, isn't it? Too bad no one's going to take your side. Darius leaned forward this time, his eyes locked on Keller's. You really think this is going to end here? He asked, his voice low but charged. You think you can humiliate me and just walk away? Keller's smirk faltered for just a second before returning. I don't think. I know. The door creaked open, and another officer stepped inside, whispering something to Keller. Keller's eyes flicked toward Darius before he stood up and walked out of the room without a word. Darius exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He knew how these situations worked. They would hold him here as long as they legally could, just to make him sweat, just to remind him that, despite everything he had achieved, they still saw him as less. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. An hour passed. Then another. The door opened again, this time revealing a sharply dressed woman with determined eyes and a briefcase in hand. She strode into the room, her heels clicking against the floor. Darius's heart lifted for the first time since the incident began. "I'm here for my client," she said, her voice echoing through the room. Keller reappeared behind her, his expression shifting the moment he saw her. "Ma'am, this is a misunderstanding," she cut him off. "The only misunderstanding is that you thought you could get away with this," she snapped, pulling out a stack of papers from her briefcase. "He's free to go. And you're going to wish you never met him." Keller's face hardened, but he didn't argue. Darius stood up, straightening his suit as he followed her out of the room. The hallway was lined with officers, some watching with interest, others avoiding his gaze. But Darius didn't care about them. His focus was locked on Keller, who stood stiffly by the door, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. Outside, the cameras were already waiting. Reporters swarmed the entrance, their microphones stretched toward him as questions flew through the air. Darius paused, letting the moment sink in before he spoke. "This is far from over," he said, his voice calm but powerful. "I'll make sure of that." As he stepped into the car waiting for him, the tension didn't fade. It only grew. The ride home was silent, but Darius's mind was loud. Every humiliation, every word Keller had spat at him replayed in his head. He thought about his mother, about the sacrifices she had made so he could stand where he was today. He thought about the people who would see the videos and recognize themselves in his story. He thought about justice, what it meant and what it was going to take to make sure Keller paid for what he had done. When he arrived home, the weight of the evening hit him all at once. He loosened his tie, pacing the length of his living room as his phone buzzed endlessly. Calls, messages, emails, support poured in from all corners, but so did the doubt. Some people questioned his story, suggested he had exaggerated the encounter or provoked it. Others defended Keller, calling him a good cop, just doing his job. Darius shut his phone off and sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. He had fought battles before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been treated like he had that night, everyone who didn't have the resources or the connections to fight back. And that's when the anger crystallized into resolve. Darius wasn't going to let this go. Keller thought he was untouchable, that his badge made him invincible. But Darius had spent his entire career tearing down men who thought they were above the law. He picked up his phone and started making calls. First to his team, then to journalists, and finally to the mayor's office. The next morning, the video of the incident was already going viral. News outlets replayed the footage on loop, dissecting every frame. Darius's name was trending. His face was everywhere. And Keller's name was starting to surface too. Darius sat in his office, scrolling through the headlines. He could feel the shift happening, the tide turning. But he also knew Keller wouldn't go down without a fight. Men like him never did. And that's what made the next step even more important. Because the real fight was just beginning. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to press down on the shoulders of everyone seated inside. Darius sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture unwavering, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench as though the weight of the world rested on this moment. The polished wood of the table reflected the overhead lights, but nothing about the room felt warm or inviting. It felt cold. Clinical. Like the kind of place where lives could be dissected, examined, and either upheld or destroyed. Across the aisle, Officer Richard Keller sat stiffly in the defendant's chair, his suit slightly wrinkled, his shoulders squared but betraying a faint tremble. His face, once so smug and untouchable, now looked pale and strained, as if the walls were closing in on him and he knew it. For weeks, this case had dominated headlines. The footage of the incident had replayed on news stations and social media platforms, igniting debates and protests. It had become more than just a legal battle, it was a symbol of something larger, a fight for accountability, for justice, for respect. The gallery was packed with reporters, activists, and everyday citizens who had come to witness what felt like history in the making. Some leaned forward in their seats, hanging on to every detail, while others sat back, arms crossed, their expressions skeptical but curious. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and the judge entered, his black robe flowing as he took his seat behind the bench. The bailiff called the room to order, and everyone stood before settling back into their chairs. Darius adjusted his tie, glancing briefly at Keller before rising to his feet. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, carrying across the silent room, "the plaintiff calls Officer Richard Keller to the stand." Keller's lawyer leaned in and whispered something, but Keller didn't respond. Instead, he rose slowly, his footsteps echoing as he made his way to the witness box. He took the oath, his voice quieter than it had been in any of his previous testimonies, and then sat down, gripping the edges of the chair like a man bracing for impact. Darius stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Keller's. "Officer Keller," he said, his tone sharp yet controlled, "can you explain to the court why you chose to approach my client's vehicle that night?" Keller shifted in his seat. "There were reports," he began, clearing his throat, "of suspicious activity in the area. I was responding to those reports." Darius nodded slowly, pacing in front of the jury. "Suspicious activity," he repeated, letting the words settle in the room before continuing. "And what exactly about my client's behavior seemed suspicious to you?" Keller hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edges of the chair. "He was parked outside a high-end restaurant," he said, his voice quieter now, "in a luxury vehicle." Darius stopped pacing and turned to face him. "And that was enough for you to approach him? To assume he was a threat?" Keller sat up straighter. "I didn't assume anything. I followed protocol." "Protocol," Darius echoed, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Is it protocol to accuse someone of stealing their own car without evidence? Is it protocol to pin someone to the ground after they've provided identification and proof of ownership?" Keller's face reddened, but he didn't speak. Darius let the silence stretch before stepping closer. "Or is it protocol to treat someone like a criminal because of the color of their skin?" A murmur rippled through the gallery, prompting the judge to rap his gavel for order. But the tension didn't ease. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, as Keller's lawyer objected. "Withdrawn," Darius said before the judge could respond. "Let's stick to the facts. Officer Keller, were you aware that my client had provided valid identification and registration before you escalated the situation?" Keller shifted uncomfortably. "Yes." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Yes. And yet you chose to ignore it." "I followed my training," Keller said, his voice sharper now. "Sometimes you don't have time to analyze every detail. You have to act." Darius leaned in, his voice dropping slightly. "Act, or overreact?" The room fell silent again. Darius didn't move, didn't blink, as Keller's jaw tensed. Reaching for the evidence table, Darius picked up a printed still from Keller's body cam footage and held it up for the jury. It showed Keller forcing Darius to the ground, his knee pressed into his back. "Is this your definition of protocol, Officer Keller?" Keller swallowed hard. He resisted. Darius's voice sharpened. "He resisted showing you his ID? He resisted complying with your orders? Or did he resist being humiliated?" Keller's lawyer objected again, but Darius didn't flinch. He turned back to the jury, his voice rising. "This is not an isolated incident. It's a pattern. And it's not just about what happened to me, it's about what's been happening to people like me for decades." He stepped closer to Keller, his voice low but searing. And you, Officer Keller, have been at the center of that pattern. Isn't that right? Keller's eyes flicked toward his lawyer, but no rescue came. Darius turned to the evidence table again, this time pulling out a folder. Your Honor, he said, his voice echoing in the chamber, I'd like to submit Exhibit C, Officer Keller's disciplinary record. The clerk took the folder and handed it to the judge, but the damage was already done. Keller's face went pale as Darius continued. Multiple complaints. Excessive force. Racial profiling. And yet, here you sit, expecting this court to believe this was just a misunderstanding. Keller snapped, his voice cracking as he shot up from his seat. You don't know what it's like out there, he shouted, his words reverberating off the walls. You don't know what it's like to face threats every day, to have seconds to decide. Darius didn't back down. You're right. I don't know what it's like to wear a badge. But I know what it's like to live with a target on my back. I know what it's like to be judged, not by my actions, but by my appearance. And I know what it's like to be humiliated and treated like I don't belong. The courtroom exploded with murmurs as the judge called for order. Keller sank back into his seat, his head hanging as the weight of his actions seemed to finally catch up to him. Darius turned to the jury, his voice clear and unwavering. This isn't just about one night. This is about justice. It's about accountability. And it's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I did. The gavel came down, signaling a recess, but Darius didn't move. He stood there, knowing this was far from over. The real reckoning was still to come. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt heavier than ever as the recess ended and the judge returned to the bench, calling everyone back to their seats. The murmurs that had filled the room during the break faded quickly, replaced by an almost suffocating silence. Darius straightened his tie, his hands steady but his pulse thudding in his ears. Across the aisle, Keller sat back down, but the man who had once worn arrogance like armor now looked stripped of all confidence. His shoulders were slouched, his eyes shifting nervously toward the jury box as though he already knew what was coming. It was the look of a man who had spent his life in control but was suddenly, undeniably, at the mercy of others. Darius stood slowly, letting the weight of the moment stretch as he walked toward the witness stand. He didn't need to raise his voice. The room was already hanging on his every word. Officer Keller, he began, his tone calm but cutting, I'd like to pick up where we left off before the break. You testified earlier that you were acting within the bounds of your training and following proper police protocol. Is that correct? Keller hesitated before nodding. Yes, he said, though his voice lacked the strength it had carried earlier in the trial. Darius took another step closer, his eyes locked on Keller's face. And that protocol you mentioned, he continued, does it include ignoring identification, proof of ownership, and cooperation from a civilian? Keller shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening on the armrests. I was acting on suspicion, he stammered. It was a high-crime area. We had reports of suspicious activity, Darius cut him off. Suspicious activity, he repeated, the words sharp and deliberate. What exactly about my actions that night struck you as suspicious, Officer Keller? Was it the fact that I was parked outside a high-end restaurant? Was it the fact that I was driving a luxury car? Or was it something else, something about how I looked? Keller's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, and Darius didn't move to fill it. He let Keller sit with the weight of the question before finally breaking the quiet. You didn't see a law-abiding citizen that night, did you? You didn't see a professional, a lawyer, or a man who had earned the right to be there. You saw a stereotype. Isn't that right? Keller's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, the judge raised a hand. Overruled. Answer the question, Officer Keller. Keller's voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. I made a mistake. Darius stepped closer, his tone sharpening. A mistake, he repeated. That's what you're calling this? Ignoring identification, ignoring evidence, shoving a man to the ground, and handcuffing him in front of a crowd of people, those were mistakes. Keller swallowed hard. I didn't know who you were. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the silence that followed them. Darius froze for just a moment, then stepped even closer, his voice low but filled with an intensity that made the entire room lean in. You didn't know who I was, he said slowly, each word landing like a blow. Is that your defense? That if I had been someone else, someone without a title, someone without connections, it would have been acceptable to treat me that way? Keller's eyes darted toward his lawyer, but no help came. He shifted again in his seat, visibly uncomfortable now. I wasn't thinking about that at the time. Darius didn't let up. No. Then what were you thinking about? Were you thinking about my license and registration, which I provided? Were you thinking about the fact that I complied with every one of your orders? Or were you thinking about the color of my skin and the kind of car I was driving? Keller opened his mouth, but Darius pressed forward before he could speak. You didn't see a man that night, Officer Keller. You saw a threat. And now you're sitting here, trying to justify that by calling it a mistake. Keller's voice cracked as he spoke. I didn't mean for it to go that far. But it did, Darius shot back. And not because of anything I did. It went that far because you made a choice to use your badge as a weapon, not as a shield. And that choice has consequences. The tension in the room was palpable, the jury leaning forward, the gallery whispering until the judge rapped his gavel for order. Keller's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, flipping through papers that no longer mattered. The damage had been done. Darius turned to the jury, his voice clear and resolute. This case isn't just about one man's actions. It's about accountability. It's about justice. It's about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else. Keller dropped his head, his hands trembling now as the reality of his situation seemed to finally hit him. But Darius wasn't done. He stepped back toward the witness stand, his voice softer but no less powerful. Officer Keller, he said, do you have anything to say to me? Or to this court? Keller looked up, his eyes glassy. I'm sorry. Darius stared at him for a long moment before answering. Sorry doesn't undo what happened that night. Sorry doesn't erase the humiliation. Sorry doesn't fix the fear that moment caused, or the damage it left behind. Keller's shoulders slumped further, his gaze falling back to the table in front of him. Darius turned back to the jury, his voice rising again. This case is about more than one night. It's about sending a message, that no one is above the law, not even those who wear a badge. It's about proving that accountability isn't optional. It's required. He let the words sink in before stepping back to his seat. The judge called for closing arguments, but Darius barely heard it. The room felt charged, the energy vibrating just beneath the surface. Across the aisle, Keller sat frozen, his lawyer whispering frantically to him. But Darius knew it was too late. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no walking it back now. As Darius sat down, he exhaled slowly, his hands folded in his lap. The jury had heard everything. They had seen the evidence. And now, all he could do was wait. But even as the tension filled the room, Darius felt something shift. Keller's world was unraveling, and the fight for justice was no longer just a possibility. It was within reach. The courtroom remained silent long after the judge called for recess. The echoes of Darius's final words still seemed to linger in the air, heavy and unshakable. Keller hadn't moved from his chair. His shoulders were hunched, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the table. His lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but Keller barely responded. His face was pale, beads of sweat forming at his temples, and for the first time since this trial began, the man who had once stood so tall now looked small. Defeated. Darius stood near the plaintiff's table, his arms crossed as he watched Keller out of the corner of his eye. He knew that look. He had seen it before. It was the look of a man realizing that the walls he had spent years building around himself were crumbling, brick by brick, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But Darius wasn't celebrating. Not yet. The weight of everything that had happened still pressed down on him, the memory of Keller's knee in his back, the sting of humiliation, the crowd stares as he was forced to the ground like an animal. That night had left a scar, one that couldn't be erased, no matter how many headlines his victory would make. The jury hadn't delivered their verdict yet, but Darius already felt the shift. The murmurs in the gallery, the way the jurors had looked at Keller during cross-examination, something had changed. The power Keller once wielded had slipped through his fingers, and now all that remained was the fallout. But as Darius sat down, his mind refused to settle. He couldn't stop thinking about what came next. Because no matter how this ended, there would be consequences. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a flood of notifications. Messages of support. Calls from reporters. Requests for interviews. The case had already spread far beyond this room, and it wasn't slowing down. People weren't just watching, they were invested. They saw themselves in his story. They saw their fears, their struggles, their frustrations reflected in every word he spoke. But with that attention came pressure, and Darius felt it tightening around him like a vice. He glanced back at Keller, who was now speaking in hushed tones with his lawyer. Whatever defense they were trying to salvage, Darius knew it wouldn't be enough. The evidence was damning. The testimonies were airtight. But as much as Darius wanted to see justice served, he also felt the weight of the moment, the understanding that Keller wasn't just a symbol. He was a man. A flawed, broken man who had let his biases consume him, but a man nonetheless. The judge returned to the bench, and the room fell quiet again. The tension was thick, almost suffocating, as the jury began filing back into the courtroom. Darius's pulse quickened. He had prepared for this moment. He had built his case brick by brick, anticipating every argument, every rebuttal. But as the foreman stood and prepared to deliver the verdict, Darius couldn't ignore the tightness in his chest. The foreman cleared his throat and began to read. Keller sat frozen, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The words seemed to stretch, each one landing like a hammer blow. Guilty. Excessive force. Violation of civil rights. Keller's head dropped lower with every count, and by the time the verdict was finished, his lawyer was already leaning in to whisper something urgent in his ear. But Keller didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the table in front of him as if the weight of the words had finally sunk in. The judge's voice broke through the tension, confirming sentencing would be scheduled at a later date. Reporters scrambled to take notes, cameras flashed, and the murmurs rose again. But Darius barely heard any of it. His focus remained on Keller, who finally lifted his head and locked eyes with him. There was something in his expression, something that Darius hadn't expected. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was fear. But buried beneath that fear was something else. Regret. As the bailiff escorted Keller out of the courtroom, Darius felt the weight in his chest shift. It wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complicated, something heavier. The victory was clear, but the scars this case had exposed weren't going to fade quickly. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown larger. Protesters held signs, news anchors spoke into cameras, and supporters cheered as Darius emerged. He kept his head high, his steps measured, but inside, his thoughts raced. Cameras flashed as microphones were shoved toward him, voices overlapping with questions he didn't have time to process. He paused, turning toward the reporters, and for the first time since the trial began, he let himself breathe. This case, he began, his voice carrying over the crowd, was never just about me. It was about accountability. About justice. About showing that no one is above the law. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him. But it's also about something bigger. It's about the conversations we need to have, the changes we need to make. Because this doesn't end here. This is just the beginning. The crowd erupted in applause, but Darius barely registered it. His mind was already moving ahead, thinking about what came next. Interviews. Protests. Legislation. The work wasn't over. It was just starting. Hours later, Darius sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His phone buzzed again, but this time, he ignored it. He needed a moment to breathe, to process everything that had happened. The victory felt hollow in some ways. Keller would face consequences, but Darius knew there were countless others just like him still walking the streets, still abusing their power. The door opened, and his assistant stepped inside, holding a stack of papers. "You need to see this," she said, setting them on his desk. Darius picked up the first sheet and felt his stomach turn. It was a statement from Keller's lawyer. An appeal. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. And as much as Darius wanted to close this chapter, he knew he couldn't. Not until justice was permanent. Not until Keller, and others like him, understood that the world was changing and there was no going back. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk as the weight of it all settled in again. The cameras were gone. The cheers had faded. But the work was just beginning. Darius sat in his office, the city lights casting faint reflections on the glass walls. His suit jacket was draped over the chair, and his tie hung loose around his neck. The papers on his desk were scattered, a mixture of legal briefs, press releases, and interview requests. His phone vibrated every few minutes, but he ignored it. The voices, the noise, the endless questions, none of it mattered at this moment. All he could hear were Keller's last words echoing in his mind. "I'm sorry." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as exhaustion finally began to settle in. The adrenaline that had carried him through the trial was fading, leaving behind a mix of relief, frustration, and something else he couldn't quite name. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. He looked up to see Camille, his assistant, standing hesitantly in the doorway. She held a folder in her hands, her expression serious. He motioned for her to come in, and she stepped closer, placing the folder carefully on the desk. "You need to see this." Her voice was quiet but steady. Darius opened the folder and felt his stomach drop as he skimmed the first page. It was Keller's appeal. His lawyer had wasted no time filing the paperwork, and while it wasn't unexpected, it still hit Darius like a punch to the gut. He closed the folder and leaned back again, staring at the ceiling as frustration boiled inside him. "He's not letting this go." Camille's voice pulled him back, and he looked up to meet her eyes. She was calm, but he could see the concern just beneath the surface. "He won't stop fighting this." Darius let out a slow breath, nodding. "I know. And neither will we." Camille hesitated before speaking again. "Are you okay?" He almost laughed at the question, but instead, he nodded. "I will be." But there was doubt in his voice, and they both heard it. She gave him a small smile before turning to leave, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth," she said, "you didn't just win today. You made people see what's really happening out there. That matters." After she left, Darius stared at the folder for a long time before finally pushing it aside. His phone buzzed again, and this time, he picked it up. It was a message from one of the reporters who had been following the case. "Breaking news," it said. Keller's wife filed for divorce. Darius's eyes scanned the message twice, then set the phone down slowly. It wasn't surprising, not after what had come out during the trial, but it still felt heavy. Later that evening, Darius found himself walking through the quiet streets near his apartment. He needed air, space to think. The sidewalks were mostly empty, and the faint hum of traffic in the distance gave the city a sense of calm that felt almost foreign after the chaos of the past few weeks. As he passed a small park, he noticed a man sitting alone on one of the benches. Even in the dim light, he recognized him instantly. Keller. Darius stopped, his heart pounding. Keller looked different, his suit was gone, replaced by jeans and a wrinkled shirt. His posture was slouched, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped tightly together. He looked up, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Keller gestured to the empty spot on the bench beside him. Darius hesitated before stepping closer and sitting down. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Keller broke it. "I know I shouldn't have asked you to sit here," he said, his voice rough. "But I saw you walking, and I don't even know what I was thinking." Darius didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say. Keller let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "My wife left. She took the kids. I've been suspended, probably fired after this is over. I lost everything." Darius's jaw tightened. "And whose fault is that?" Keller flinched but didn't argue. "Mine," he said quietly. "All mine." He looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was protecting people. But I wasn't protecting anyone. I was hurting them. I hurt you." Darius stared straight ahead, his voice cold. "You didn't just hurt me. You humiliated me. You treated me like I was less than human. You used your badge as a weapon, and you thought you'd get away with it." Keller swallowed hard. "I know. And I can't take it back." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Darius could feel the weight of Keller's words, but it didn't ease the anger still burning inside him. Finally, Keller turned to him, his eyes red. "I know you think I'm just trying to save myself. And maybe I am. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for what I did to you, but for all of it. For the times I looked the other way. For the people I hurt before you. For the ones I'll never get to apologize to." Darius didn't move, didn't speak. He wanted to believe Keller, but part of him couldn't. Part of him refused to let go of the anger, the humiliation, the years of fighting to be seen as equal. He stood up slowly, looking down at Keller. "Sorry doesn't fix what you did." Keller nodded. "I know." Darius turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady. The conversation replayed in his head as he moved through the streets, the weight of it pressing down on him. He wanted closure, but he wasn't sure if this was it. Keller had lost everything, his job, his family, his reputation. But was that enough? Did justice mean punishment, or did it mean change? Back at his apartment, Darius stood by the window, staring out at the city below. He thought about the people who had supported him, the ones who had reached out to share their own stories. He thought about the ones who hadn't been able to fight back. The ones who never got justice. And he thought about Keller, sitting alone on that bench, broken and lost. The fight wasn't over. The appeal was coming. But for the first time since this began, Darius felt something shift. He didn't know if it was forgiveness or just exhaustion, but it was something. And whatever it was, he knew it would shape what came next. The question was, what would he do with it? Darius sat alone in his office, the faint hum of the city outside filtering through the windows as the weight of the last few days settled heavily on his shoulders. The papers spread out in front of him blurred together, legal jargon and highlighted sections swimming in his vision as exhaustion gnawed at him. He leaned back in his chair, letting his head rest against the leather cushion, but the tension in his chest refused to ease. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was Keller sitting on that bench, broken and defeated, his words echoing over and over again. "I'm sorry." He wanted to believe it meant something. He wanted to believe it mattered. But the anger still simmered just beneath the surface, sharp and unrelenting. The knock at his door pulled him back, and he sat up quickly, straightening his tie as Camille stepped inside. She held another folder, her expression tight. He knew that look. It meant bad news. She set the folder down carefully and hesitated, her voice softer than usual. "You should read this." Darius opened it without a word, scanning the first few pages before his stomach dropped. It was a statement from Keller's lawyer, not just appealing the verdict but filing a countersuit against Darius for defamation. He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing through the room as Camille flinched. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the office as his pulse quickened. This is ridiculous. He can't seriously think he has a case. Camille stepped closer, her voice steady but cautious. It's not about the case. It's about leverage. He knows this will drag out the process, force you to keep reliving it, and he's hoping you'll settle. Darius shook his head, his voice sharp. I'm not settling. Not with him. Not after everything he's done. Camille nodded, but her eyes held the kind of concern that made his stomach twist. I didn't think you would, but you need to be prepared. This isn't just about the courtroom anymore. It's about perception. About how people see you and how they see him. And right now, there are people who feel sorry for him. Darius stopped pacing, turning to face her. Sorry for him? Camille didn't flinch. He lost his job, his family, and his reputation. Some people are calling it too much. They're saying the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Darius's voice rose, his frustration spilling out. The punishment doesn't fit the crime. He humiliated me. He used his badge to abuse his power, and now that he's facing the consequences, he wants to play the victim. Camille's voice softened. I know. And the people who matter know too. But the ones who don't, they're the ones he's trying to reach with this countersuit. He wants sympathy. And if we're not careful, he's going to get it. Darius ran a hand down his face, the exhaustion pressing in harder. He wanted to fight. He wanted to keep pushing until Keller was nothing more than a cautionary tale. But the thought of reliving it all, of standing in another courtroom and seeing Keller's face again, made his stomach churn. He sank back into his chair, his voice quieter now. What if this never ends? Camille stepped closer, leaning down so he had no choice but to meet her eyes. Then we keep fighting. The sound of her heels faded as she left, and Darius stared at the folder on his desk, his thoughts spiraling. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier. He picked up the folder again, flipping through the pages slowly this time, letting the words sink in. Keller wasn't done. He wasn't giving up, and Darius couldn't either. Later that night, Darius sat in his living room, the glow of the city lights spilling in through the windows. He sipped his whiskey slowly, the burn doing little to dull the ache in his chest. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen to see an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it, but something made him pick up. The voice on the other end was quiet, hesitant. It was Keller. I didn't think you'd answer. Darius stayed silent, his jaw tightening as Keller continued. I needed to talk to you. Darius's voice was sharp. About what? Keller exhaled, the sound shaky. About everything. About the appeal. I didn't know my lawyer was filing it until today. I told him I didn't want to drag this out anymore, but he said I didn't have a choice. Darius's grip tightened on the phone. So now you're playing the victim? Keller's voice cracked. No. I'm not. I don't know what to do anymore. I lost my job. My family won't talk to me. I can't even walk down the street without someone looking at me like I'm a monster. And maybe I deserve that, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm drowning. Darius leaned back, his voice cold. And what do you want from me? Keller hesitated. I don't know. Forgiveness? Redemption? I don't even know if I deserve those things. But I can't keep living like this. Darius's voice softened just slightly. Do you think I can? Do you think I can just forget what you did to me? Keller's voice broke. No. I don't. I wouldn't expect you to. But I need to try to fix it. I don't even know how, but I need to try. Darius closed his eyes, the weight of Keller's words pressing down on him. He didn't know if he believed him. He didn't know if he cared. But the desperation in Keller's voice was real, and for the first time, Darius felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something that resembled understanding. I can't fix this for you, Darius said finally. Only you can do that. Keller's voice was barely a whisper. I know. The call ended, but Darius didn't move. He sat there, staring at the phone, wondering if Keller's words meant anything at all. Wondering if change was even possible. The anger was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't burning the way it had before. It was quieter. Controlled. Darius poured another drink and sat back, the weight of the case, the appeal, and Keller's broken voice still heavy in his mind. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing: this wasn't over. Not yet. And no matter how much he wanted to leave it behind, he couldn't. Because justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about change. And Darius wasn't done fighting for it. The courtroom was packed again, but this time it wasn't for arguments or testimonies. It was for sentencing. Darius sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands resting lightly on the polished wood, his shoulders squared but his expression unreadable. Across the room, Keller sat beside his lawyer, his suit neatly pressed but his posture hollow, as if the weight of everything had finally settled onto his shoulders. The judge entered, and the room rose before quickly settling back into their seats. Darius exhaled slowly, his pulse steady now, calmer than it had been through the whirlwind of hearings, accusations, and revelations that had brought them to this moment. Keller didn't look at him. Not once. His eyes stayed locked on the judge, but Darius could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped lightly against his knee as though he couldn't stop himself. Darius had spent weeks thinking about this moment, about what justice would look like and whether it would ever feel like enough. He knew it wouldn't erase what had happened, but it could mark the beginning of something bigger. The judge began speaking, outlining the case, the charges, the evidence that had been presented. The words blurred together for Darius until the final sentence snapped everything back into focus. Keller was found guilty on multiple counts: abuse of power, excessive force, and civil rights violations. He was sentenced to time in prison and stripped of his pension. A wave of whispers rippled through the gallery, and Keller's shoulders slumped visibly as if the verdict had finally broken through the last piece of armor he had left. Darius didn't move, didn't flinch, as Keller was led away in handcuffs, his face pale and hollow. It should have felt like closure, but Darius knew it was only part of the story. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but the real work was just beginning. Weeks passed, and Keller's name disappeared from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new stories, but Darius's didn't. His face continued to appear on news panels, in interviews, at rallies calling for reform. He became a voice that people recognized, one that demanded accountability and refused to be silenced. Yet even as the world around him moved forward, Darius couldn't quite let go of the weight Keller's actions had left behind. One evening, as Darius packed up his office after another long day, Camille entered, holding a letter. No sender. Just his name scrawled across the front. She set it down and left without saying a word, but her expression told him enough. It was from Keller. Darius stared at it for a long time before finally opening it. The handwriting was rough, uneven, but the words hit harder than he expected. Keller's voice echoed in every line, regret, guilt, and desperation tangled together in an apology that felt raw and unpolished. He wrote about the time he had spent in his cell, reflecting on his choices and the patterns that had brought him there. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to justify his actions. He admitted his faults and acknowledged the lives he had damaged, including Darius's. The letter ended with a single line that lingered in Darius's mind long after he put it down. "I don't expect redemption, but I hope one day I can be better than the man you faced in that courtroom." Darius set the letter aside, his chest tightening. He didn't know if Keller's words were genuine or just another attempt to ease his own guilt, but for the first time, Darius felt something shift. Not forgiveness, but acceptance, the understanding that Keller would carry his punishment and his guilt, but Darius didn't have to carry the anger anymore. In the months that followed, Darius's life changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was offered a seat on the city's police reform committee, working to ensure officers were trained to recognize and confront their biases before they ever put on a badge. He traveled to speak at conferences, to tell his story and push for stronger protections against abuses of power. And with every speech, every panel, and every meeting, he saw the ripple effects of what had started as a personal battle but had grown into something much larger. Keller's life, however, took a very different turn. The reports that trickled out of the prison painted a picture of a man stripped down to his core, forced to face the reality of the choices he had made. Some said he kept to himself, while others mentioned programs he had joined to help former officers confront their prejudices. Whether he truly changed or simply adapted to survive, Darius never found out. He chose not to respond to the letter, leaving Keller's redemption, or lack of it, to be his own journey. Darius stood on the steps of the courthouse one last time, looking out at the crowd gathered below. The cameras were there, as always, but so were the faces that had supported him from the beginning, friends, family, strangers who had seen themselves in his fight. He adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. This case was never just about me. It was about every person who has ever been judged, dismissed, or mistreated because of how they look, where they come from, or what someone assumes about them. It was about accountability, not just for one man, but for a system that has failed too many people for too long. And today isn't the end. It's the start of something bigger. A fight for fairness, for equality, for justice that doesn't stop at the courtroom doors. He stepped back, the applause rising, but his mind was already turning toward what came next. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. So what about you? What would you have done in Darius's place? Would you have pushed for justice no matter the cost? Or would you have let anger consume you? The truth is, we all face moments that test who we are, moments where we have to decide whether we're going to stand up or back down. This story isn't just about Darius or Keller. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make and the legacy we leave behind. Thank you for staying with us through this emotional journey. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it made you question the way we see justice, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after they're over.